It began with the sound of a door closing behind her, a sound that no one realized, in that fleeting second, would mark the start of tragedy that would ripple through an entire community. It was the evening of January 27th, 2025, in Mesa, Arizona. 14-year-old Emily Pike stepped out of group home where she lived, a modest building tucked in a quiet residential neighborhood. The staff remembered her wearing a pink and gray top, her dark hair falling loosely around her face. She didn't take much with her. No bag, no phone, just a restless sense of needing to leave. Somewhere beyond the chain-link fence that surrounded the property, the city hummed in its usual rhythm: headlights, asphalt, and the faint echo of desert wind. But for Emily, who had spent much of her young life moving between care facilities, foster homes, and shelters, the world outside that gate must have felt both terrifying and liberating. At first, her absence didn't set off alarm bells. Teenagers in care often run. The staff explained to police. They called it AWOL behavior. Some came back within hours. Some didn't. Emily had done it before, more than once. But this time, something felt different. When surveillance footage later surfaced, showing her walking alone into the night, her posture seemed both determined and uncertain, as though she was running to something or away from everything. No one could have guessed that this grainy video would become the last known image of her alive. The days that followed were filled with growing unease. Her case was filed as a missing juvenile, one among dozens that week. But for those who knew Emily, the staff, her social worker, the other girls in the home, there was an edge to the silence that followed. Days turned into a week, then two, and the air around Mesa began to change. Her mother, Marissa Pike, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. She called the police every day, pressing for updates. She had seen this pattern before, how the system treated indigenous girls who disappeared. Slow response, limited media attention, minimal coordination. Emily was San Carlos Apache, and her mother feared that might mean her daughter's case would vanish in bureaucracy, just like so many others. Still, she hoped. She posted flyers, reached out to reporters, and begged the group home for any information they might have missed. But no one could tell her what direction Emily went after she walked away that night. It was as though the desert had swallowed her whole. Then came February 14th, 2025. Two hikers traveling along Highway 60, near milepost 277, in a remote area outside Globe, noticed something odd off the side of the road. Black garbage bags, several of them, partially hidden among rocks and brush. When authorities opened them, what they found was beyond comprehension. Inside were human remains, dismembered and incomplete. Investigators could not immediately determine identity or cause of death. But days later, DNA confirmed what Marissa already feared. The remains belonged to her daughter, Emily Pike. The announcement hit the community like a storm. The child who walked away from a group home had been found brutally murdered, her body discarded like trash in the desert. And the questions that followed were devastating. How did she end up there? Who did this to her? And, most haunting of all, could her death have been prevented? The Gila County Sheriff's Office launched a full investigation, classifying the case as a homicide, but answers were scarce. The condition of the remains made determining a clear timeline difficult. The location, remote, rocky, and hours from where Emily was last seen, suggested she hadn't gotten there alone. In the weeks after the discovery, rumors swirled on social media. Some claimed she had been taken. Others accused the group home of negligence. Police neither confirmed nor denied any theory. And amid the chaos, a disturbing leak made things worse. Graphic images from the crime scene surfaced online, posted without authorization. The Pike family learned of their daughter's death not through a formal police visit, but through social media. It was a violation beyond words. The leak forced investigators to clamp down on communication. The public was told little beyond the basics. Emily's death was suspicious, foul play was suspected, and no arrests had been made. Still, those who knew her began to speak out, not about suspects, but about the system that had failed her. Because before Emily's death became a criminal investigation, it was already part of a larger crisis, one that indigenous families have been shouting about for years. The epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls MILG. And in Emily's case, the failure seemed painfully clear. She had vanished from a state-funded group home. She had begged authorities not to send her back there in the past. She had warned people she didn't feel safe. Yet she was sent there again. The deeper journalists and advocates dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Emily's group home, one of many under state contracts, had a record of repeated runaway incidents. Staff turnover was high. Oversight was minimal. The Arizona Department of Child Safety, DCS, was supposed to monitor these homes, but budget cuts, staffing shortages, and administrative gaps meant many inspections were delayed or incomplete. And Emily, like so many others, slipped through the cracks. When her remains were found, the DCS quietly opened an internal review. But to Marissa, it was too late. The system that was supposed to protect her daughter had lost her, not once, but forever. Still, amid the heartbreak, something else began to grow, a movement. Emily's face appeared on murals, billboards, and memorial posters across San Carlos and Mesa. Her name became a rallying cry at MMIW awareness marches. Activists called for new legislation, one that would ensure that no indigenous child's disappearance could ever be ignored again. They called it Emily's Law, a proposal to create a turquoise alert system for missing indigenous people modeled after the Amber Alert. It would mobilize rapid response teams, social media alerts, and cross-jurisdiction cooperation the moment someone went missing. Because if someone had sounded the alarm when Emily first walked out that door, perhaps, just perhaps, she might have been found before it was too late. But the system didn't sound the alarm. And on that cold desert road off Highway 60, the silence spoke louder than anything. The desert has a way of holding its silence. Wind scours away footprints, sun bleaches away evidence, and time folds tragedy into sand until only the persistent remember. But on that February morning, the desert broke its silence, and in the process, exposed something that would haunt Arizona for months. The discovery of Emily Pike's remains off Highway 60 sent shockwaves through the Gila County Sheriff's Office. The call came in from two hikers who thought they'd stumbled upon dump construction waste. What they found instead was a nightmare. Black garbage bags, heavy, torn in places, each revealing fragments of a human story violently cut short. When investigators arrived, they found the terrain steep and dry, dotted with creosote and brittle brush. The bags had been dragged downhill, snagged against rocks and thorn bushes. Coyotes had been through them. The decomposition made identification nearly impossible at first glance. Even hardened detectives struggled to process the scene. It wasn't just a killing. It was an act of disposal, deliberate and cold. Forensic teams worked through the night. Every item near the scene, fabric scraps, dirt samples, fibers, was cataloged. The state crime lab was brought in for DNA processing. Within days, a partial match came back. It was Emily. Her mother, Marissa, was called to provide a sample for confirmation. She had barely slept since Emily vanished. When officers arrived at her door in San Carlos, she already knew what they were going to say. A mother's intuition sharper than any evidence. But hearing it spoken aloud broke something inside her. The next morning, she stood before cameras, her voice trembling but steady. "My daughter didn't deserve this," she said. "She was supposed to be safe. The state told me she'd be safe." In the following weeks, the investigation widened. Detectives retraced Emily's last known movements from the group home in Mesa. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed her walking east, crossing an intersection, then disappearing beyond the edge of camera range. That was the last definitive sighting. There were no recorded phone calls, no social media posts, no confirmed sightings. It was as if she had simply walked out of one world and been erased by another. Investigators began looking into the group home itself, operated under contract with Arizona's Department of Child Safety, DCS. On paper, the facility was supposed to provide stability and therapeutic care for at-risk girls. In reality, it was one of dozens of homes stretched thin, underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Records later revealed that in the 12 months before Emily's disappearance, the home had reported at least 18 runaway incidents. Some residents were missing for hours, others for days. The staff, mostly overworked young caregivers, struggled to keep up. When Emily ran away that night, the on-duty worker followed protocol, report to local police, file a missing person notice, and wait. But the system treated it like any other runaway, not as an emergency. And so, hours turned into days. The Amber Alert system wasn't triggered because Emily's disappearance didn't meet the specific abduction criteria. That loophole, critics would later say, cost her life. Detectives traced possible transport routes between Mesa and Globe. The 80-mile stretch of desert highway is long and sparsely populated, a route used by long-haul truckers, service workers, and late-night commuters. Along the way are dozens of dirt pullouts where a vehicle could stop unseen. For investigators, it was both a possible lead and a labyrinth of dead ends. Crime scene analysts noted that Emily's body had been dismembered post-mortem, suggesting deliberate concealment. Whoever had left her there had knowledge of remote terrain, or at least the confidence to dump evidence far from prying eyes. But beyond that, the investigation stalled. No vehicle footage, no phone ping, no witness. Just that last glimpse on camera, a girl in a pink and gray top, walking into darkness. The media caught wind of the case in late February. Local outlets like AZ Family, ABC 15, and KJZZ began to question why Emily's disappearance had received so little attention before her death. By March, her name had become a rallying cry among indigenous advocacy groups. Social media was flooded with her image, bright smile, soft eyes, and the caption, "Justice for Emily." In San Carlos, community members held candlelight vigils and painted murals in turquoise and red, the colors symbolizing missing and murdered indigenous women and girls. For many, Emily's death wasn't just another tragedy. It was proof that the system had learned nothing. Activists demanded answers from Arizona DCS, whose oversight failures had already been documented in prior state audits. Emily's file showed multiple red flags, including prior requests from her to be transferred out of the group home, citing discomfort and alleged mistreatment. Yet, no transfer was approved. She was placed back there each time she ran. One former staff member later told reporters, "We were told she was a handful, but Emily wasn't trouble. She was scared. She just wanted to go home." The state's silence only fueled outrage. Lawmakers were pressed to respond. Indigenous leaders met with the governor's office and attorney general, urging them to create an alert system specifically for missing indigenous youth, one that would bypass the rigid requirement of the Amber Alert and issue immediate statewide notifications. From those meetings, Emily's Law began to take shape. It proposed the creation of a turquoise alert system designed to notify the public within hours when an indigenous person went missing, regardless of age or abduction status. The color turquoise was chosen for its cultural significance, protection, healing, and remembrance. It was a law born out of heartbreak, and Emily's mother became its voice. Standing on courthouse steps, she addressed the press again. If they had looked for her the way they look for other children, she said, maybe she'd still be here. Her words cut deep, and for once, lawmakers listened. While legislative momentum built, investigators quietly continued their work. Forensic teams re-examined the materials found at the dump site, the garbage bags, the bindings, the soil. They looked for tire tracks, shoe impressions, even trace pollen that might link the location to a vehicle or property elsewhere. But nothing concrete emerged. Meanwhile, leads from the public poured in: sightings, tips, online theories. Some seemed credible, others far-fetched. The Gila County Sheriff's Office had to sift through hundreds of messages. Every new rumor reignited the pain. And yet, through it all, the official statement never changed. No suspects publicly identified. Investigation ongoing. By April, the desert had begun to bloom again. Wildflowers dotted the same hillsides where Emily had been found. Search teams returned to the area one last time, combing for evidence missed during the initial sweep. They found nothing new, but one officer later said he'd never forget that place. "You could feel it," he told a reporter off record, like the ground was still keeping secrets. Those words stayed with people, because in many ways, the desert did still have secrets, and it wasn't finished speaking. What had happened between that quiet Mesa street and the lonely highway miles away? Who had taken a young girl's life and left her in pieces? And how many other Emilys were still waiting for someone to listen? In the months that followed, Emily's story would ignite a reckoning, not just in law enforcement, but across an entire state that had too often looked away. And it all began with one unanswered question. Why wasn't anyone looking sooner? By early February, the search for Emily Pike had begun to fray at its edges. The posters that once looked hopeful were now sun-bleached and curling off telephone poles. The volunteers, those same neighbors who had shown up with coffee and flashlights, were quietly slipping back into their lives, their absence marked by silence. But Detective Ramirez, the Mesa police investigator leading the case, refused to let it fade. "We're not done," she told her team one morning, pacing the narrow strip of carpet inside the command post. Emily didn't just vanish. Someone knows something. There were still fragments to sort through. Footage from nearby convenience stores, cross-reference timestamps from traffic cameras, and interviews from people who claimed to have seen her, but none of it stitched together cleanly. The last confirmed image of Emily was at 9:48 p.m. the night she disappeared. Surveillance from a small gas station off Southern Avenue caught a reflection in the window, head down, walking fast, clutching what looked like her phone. Beyond that, the city swallowed her whole. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the next piece surfaced. On February 14th, 2025, two hikers traveling along a remote stretch near Highway 60, a place where the Sonoran Desert presses up against concrete, noticed something strange. A set of trash bags, torn open by wind or animals, sitting half-hidden beneath brittle mesquite. At first, they thought it was illegal dumping, the kind of thing locals complained about often. But as they drew closer, the air changed. There was a smell you never forget. They called 911. Within hours, the area was sealed off. Deputies moved carefully through the brush, their radios crackling against the dry wind. Under the harsh light of portable lamps, the truth emerged. Inside those bags were human remains. Days later, the medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. It was Emily Pike. The news rippled across Arizona like a shockwave. Candlelight vigils turned into scenes of stunned quiet. People stood in clusters, holding photos of Emily printed from the same flyer that once asked if anyone had seen her alive. Now, they only asked, who did this? The discovery forced investigators to rethink everything. The condition of the remains suggested she had been deceased for some time, likely since shortly after she disappeared. The location, miles from where she was last seen, raised even more questions. How did she get there? Who drove her? Why that place, of all the stretches of desert in Arizona? Detective Ramirez told reporters this wasn't random. Someone made choices about how to move her, where to leave her, and what not to leave behind. Behind the scenes, crime scene technicians worked relentlessly. Every shred of material, duct tape, fibers, dirt, was cataloged. Forensic teams sifted through what little evidence could survive in the desert heat. DNA was extracted, but the environment had been cruel to it. What investigators did have was geography. Highway 60 connects Mesa to the broader East Valley, a corridor lined with industrial parks, old motels, and scrubland. It's a stretch of road that both hides and reveals, depending on what you're looking for. Somewhere along that line, someone knew how to disappear a person, and that possibility drew public scrutiny toward the group home system itself. Emily had walked out of a state-run facility, one meant to protect and rehabilitate vulnerable young women. But how? People asked, could someone simply leave without supervision, without follow-up? The Arizona Department of Child Safety launched an internal review. They discovered what advocates had warned for years: underfunded programs, high staff turnover, and lax reporting protocols. The group home where Emily stayed wasn't unique. It was one of many facilities stretched thin, where one or two staff might watch over half a dozen girls. In the weeks following the discovery, Emily's law began to take shape. Drafted by State Senator Ilenia Morales, the proposed legislation sought to mandate GPS-enabled supervision for at-risk residents in state care, real-time reporting when a youth leaves the premises, and improved oversight training for staff. Emily was failed by a system that was supposed to keep her safe, Senator Morales said during a press conference. We can't undo what happened, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. The debate became a lightning rod. Some criticized the proposal for overreach, fearing it would criminalize or surveil minors in care. Others saw it as long overdue, a necessary safeguard in a broken structure. Meanwhile, in Mesa, Emily's family faced the grim logistics no parent should. Funeral arrangements, autopsy reports, boxes of personal belongings handed back in plastic bags. Her mother, Rachel Pike, refused to attend press conferences. When she finally spoke, weeks later, it was through tears at a community vigil. "She didn't deserve to be forgotten in a field," she said softly. "My daughter was more than a case number." For the detectives still working the case, that sentence became a mantra. The police established a tip line. Leads trickled in, some credible, others desperate guesses. One caller claimed to have seen Emily near a pickup truck days after she vanished. Another said they recognized her from a party on the outskirts of Apache Junction. Each tip was logged, chased, and either collapsed or branched into new uncertainty. The night patrol officers in Mesa began treating every empty lot, every roadside turnoff, like a possible clue. Because in Arizona's desert, things don't vanish. They get buried under heat and time. Still, something didn't add up. Emily's remains were found too far from her last known location for her to have walked. No vehicle of hers was reported stolen, and the group home's door log suggested she left quietly. No one followed her out. Detective Ramirez had a theory. Someone might have picked her up that night. Someone she trusted, but without digital breadcrumbs. No working cell phone data, no credit card trail, no witnesses after that 9:48 timestamp. The investigation stood on shifting sand. The eerie part wasn't just that Emily had disappeared. It was that the hours between leaving the group home and ending up along Highway 60 were a blank space, a void, and the desert, vast and indifferent, wasn't giving up its answers easily. By the time February turned to March, the community's grief had hardened into something else. A quiet, simmering anger. Signs demanding justice for Emily appeared outside the group home. The same building she once walked out became a symbol of failure, cordoned off by crime scene tape and media trucks. And still, the question hung in the air, heavier than the desert heat. Who took Emily Pike into the night, and why? By the time March arrived, the desert around Mesa began to change. The air grew warmer, the dust storms more frequent, and the flowers that lined the washes started to bloom. But for investigators, there was no renewal, only frustration. Emily Pike's case had entered what detectives call the circle of silence. Everyone they spoke to had something to say, but none of it fit. Detective Ramirez sat in the briefing room one morning, the walls plastered with photos. Emily smiling at a community fair, Emily's last known outfit, a pink and gray top, and in the center, a wide satellite image of the desert stretch off Highway 60. A red pin marked the discovery site. They had theories, but no proof. One possibility. Emily might have reached out to someone she'd known before a placement in the group home, someone from the outside world. Another, she'd tried to run, only to cross paths with someone dangerous. But the digital trail was dead. Her phone had stopped pinging less than an hour after she walked out. Investigators later confirmed it had been manually powered off. To Ramirez, that single fact meant everything. If Emily turned it off, she said to a colleague, it means she didn't want to be tracked. But if someone else did, it means she wasn't alone. In any other case, that might have been a small clue. But here, it was a crack in a wall of silence. The group home staff were cooperative, at least on paper. They handed over logs, surveillance footage, and contact lists. But gaps appeared everywhere. One camera covering the side exit, the same door Emily was last seen walking through, had malfunctioned days before. Another employee admitted they hadn't seen Emily for hours before her disappearance, assuming she was asleep. When investigators pressed further, they hit resistance, not from individuals, but from the system itself. Arizona's group home network, it turned out, was a patchwork. Different contractors managed different facilities, each bound by loose state oversight. Policies on resident check-ins varied widely. What one home treated as a missing report, another might classify as unauthorized leave. That bureaucracy had delayed the initial alert on Emily's disappearance. It wasn't reported to Mesa PD until nearly 12 hours after she'd gone missing. By then, whatever chance they had to track her movements in real time had vanished into the dark. For Ramirez, that delay was unforgivable. 12 hours. she told a local journalist, is the difference between rescue and recovery. In the weeks after her body was found, journalists started pulling public records. What they found fueled outrage. Over 50 similar walkaway incidents from group homes in the Phoenix area in the past 2 years. Most were resolved safely, but not all. Emily Pike's name had become a symbol of something much larger than one tragedy. And yet, beneath the headlines and legislative hearings, there was still a human story, the moments that got lost in the noise. People close to Emily describe her as restless, often caught between bursts of laughter and sudden quiet. She'd spent much of her teenage life in state care, cycling through homes and temporary placements. The instability had chipped away at her trust in adults, but she still had hope. She'd been talking about finding a job at a local coffee shop. She wanted to earn enough to afford her own apartment, to start fresh, as she put it. Friends remembered she loved sketching desert landscapes, particularly the ones with power lines stretching toward the horizon. To her, they represented escape. But the version of Emily caught on that final surveillance video, the one walking away from the group home, was different. Her steps were quick, her shoulders hunched. Not running, not wandering, just determined. Detectives combed through her belongings after the autopsy was complete. Among them, a half-filled journal, a silver ring, and a list of handwritten names with partial phone numbers. One of those numbers traced back to a prepaid phone later found inactive. Another dead end. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted. Candlelight vigils turned into protests. The phrase "Justice for Emily" began trending statewide. Advocates demanded reform, and families of other group home residents began sharing their own fears. At one rally in downtown Phoenix, a mother held up a sign that read, "If it happened to Emily, it can happen to ours." In response, state lawmakers fast-tracked Emily's law through its first round of committee hearings. The proposal included GPS alert systems for residents leaving unaccompanied, mandatory missing person reporting within 2 hours, and increased funding for staff-to-resident ratios. It was a political moment charged with grief and a kind of eerie irony. The state had failed Emily in life, and now it was building an entire framework in her name. But while the policy debate raged, Emily's investigation began to cool. There were no arrests, no suspects publicly named, just the desert, keeping its secrets. That was until mid-March, when a lead surfaced from an unlikely source. A man named Caleb Jennings, a transient who frequented the outskirts of Apache Junction, walked into a sheriff's substation claiming he'd seen a girl who looked like the one on the flyers. He told deputies that around the time Emily disappeared, he'd been camping near an abandoned gas stop east of Mesa. One night, he said, he saw a car pull off the road. Inside, a girl matching Emily's description sat in the passenger seat, arguing with someone. Jennings couldn't recall the license plate, but he remembered one detail. A loud metallic clatter, something like a tool falling to the ground. Investigators returned to the scene he described, combing through the dirt and weeds. After hours of searching, a crime scene tech found it, a rusted wrench half buried. It was too degraded for fingerprints, but it placed Emily, at least potentially, within a few miles of where her remains were later found. Was it coincidence? Or had they finally found a breadcrumb on the path she took that night? For Ramirez, the discovery reignited something. She ordered a full review of automotive repair shops and scrapyards along Highway 60. If Emily had been transported in a vehicle, perhaps there were surveillance cameras nearby. Maybe one had captured a car that didn't belong. Meanwhile, in the shadows of social media, theories spread faster than facts. Some claimed Emily was running from abuse. Others insisted she trusted the wrong person. A few went further, spinning conspiracies about trafficking rings and cover-ups. The noise became deafening. But through it, one truth remained. No one had been held accountable. Rachel Pike, Emily's mother, refused to let the world forget. Every time someone shares her story, she said in an interview, I feel like she's still here, like she's still walking with us, asking for the truth. That truth, however, still hid somewhere out there, along the lonely highways and dry riverbeds of Arizona. And as the desert wind began to shift once more, Detective Ramirez made a quiet vow. She would not let Emily become another cold file in a steel cabinet, Because even if no one was talking, the desert was always listening. The desert holds memories differently than people do. It doesn't forget, it just buries. Wind and time are its accomplices, sweeping away tracks, swallowing sounds, covering what was left behind. But sometimes when you look closely enough, it whispers. And in early April 2025, the desert began to whisper again. Detective Ramirez hadn't slept well in weeks. Her desk at the Mesa precinct was crowded with files, coffee cups, and a growing sense of unfinished business. Emily Pike's case had stalled, but something about the wrench found near Highway 60 gnawed at her. It was small, almost inconsequential, but it didn't belong where it was. The kind of tool you'd expect to find in a mechanic's bay, not buried in the desert. So Ramirez did what good investigators do. She went backward. She revisited old interviews, checked employment logs, and reread transcripts. That's when she noticed a name she'd skimmed before, Darren Holt, a part-time maintenance worker at the group home where Emily had been staying. He'd quit a week before she disappeared. On paper, his exit looked normal, personal reasons. But there was something off. His forwarding address was blank. His emergency contact number disconnected. When detectives ran his name through public databases, they found a string of minor offenses, trespassing, disorderly conduct, a suspended license. Nothing violent. Nothing that screamed danger. But he also owned a 2003 Ford Ranger, the kind of truck known for its old, noisy suspension and loose metal parts. A vehicle that could easily produce a clattering sound on the side of a dark road. Ramirez's pulse quickened. She requested surveillance from gas stations along the possible route from the group home to Highway 60. Hours of footage poured in grainy, time-stamped, endless. Then, at 10:03 p.m. on January 27th, a clerk's camera caught it. A dark Ford Ranger pulling up to a vending machine near the freeway. A young woman in a pink and gray top stood beside it. The image was blurred, but it was her, Emily Pike. The footage changed everything. Detectives traced the truck to Holt's name and issued a warrant. But by the time they arrived at his last known residence, a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of Queen Creek, he was gone. Neighbors said he'd left in a hurry around mid-February, just days after Emily's remains were found. Inside the trailer, investigators found scattered tools, empty beer cans, and a stained Arizona map pinned to the wall. A single route was highlighted in red, stretching from Mesa to the very section of Highway 60 where Emily had been discovered. To the public, none of this was known yet. The Mesa Police Department remained cautious, careful not to release details that could compromise the search. But word began to leak. Local news hinted at a person of interest. The tone shifted from mourning to tension. For Emily's mother, it was both hope and horror. If they find him, Rachel Pike said quietly to a reporter, "I just want to know why. What did he say to her? What made her get in that truck?" It's a question investigators still couldn't answer. Because even if Holt picked Emily up willingly, there was a missing piece. Motive. Why her? Why that night? Theories emerged, some pointed opportunity, others to familiarity. Holt had reportedly done minor repairs at the group home and interacted with residents occasionally. If Emily knew him, she might have trusted him enough to accept a ride. But trust, in this case, may have been fatal. By mid-April, the Arizona Department of Public Safety joined the search for Holt. His truck was later spotted abandoned near Globe, Arizona, almost 70 miles east. Inside were 2 empty water bottles, a torn shirt, and a single prepaid phone. Investigators believed he might still be alive, hiding out in the remote Tonto Basin area. That same week, Emily's law passed its 3rd legislative reading in the Arizona State Senate. Lawmakers invoked her name with solemnity, the chamber briefly silent before the vote. The bill, now headed for the governor's desk, was both a victory and a tragedy, a reminder of how reform often comes too late. Yet even as policy advanced, the case grew darker. Forensic analysis of the Ford Ranger revealed small biological traces, too degraded for DNA confirmation, but consistent with Emily's profile. That was enough for police to name Holt publicly as a suspect. The official press release went out on April 21st. The same day, social media exploded. Hashtags like #JusticeForEmily and #FindHolt trended across the state. Armchair detectives dissected every known photo, every lead, spinning maps and timelines. But amidst the noise, the real investigation continued quietly, methodically. Ramirez refused to let the frenzy distract her. To her, Emily's story wasn't content. It was a promise. Late one night, she stood by the edge of Highway 60, looking out at the stretch where Emily's body had been found. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the faint smell of creosote after rain. She thought about the photo of Emily at 16, smiling under a paper lantern at a summer fair, her eyes lit with a softness that still seemed alive. "Tell me what happened," Ramirez whispered into the dark. Because the silence wasn't just haunting anymore, it was personal. Over the next few weeks, search teams combed to the basin, using drones and tracking dogs. They found traces of campfires, tire ruts, and discarded wrappers. But Holt remained a shadow. Some believed he'd taken his own life in the wilderness. Others thought he'd crossed state lines. As weeks turned into months, the heat returned to Arizona, and the desert began its slow work of erasure once more. But Emily's name stayed alive. Murals appeared in downtown Mesa, her face surrounded by desert flowers. The local news continued to revisit her case every Sunday, and true crime forums tracked every mention of Holt. For once, it seemed, the public wasn't letting go. That mattered to Rachel Pike. "People say time heals," she said at a May vigil. "But time doesn't heal if you don't know the truth. Time just makes the silence louder." It was then that the whispers began again. A hiker claimed to have seen a man fitting Holt's description buying supplies at a rest stop near Safford. Another said they'd found a small fire pit with tools nearby. Deputies investigated each lead. Nothing definitive, but they were close enough to keep Ramirez moving, because deep down she knew stories like Emily's don't end in clean arrests or tidy resolutions. They end in echoes, in the people left behind, the policies rewritten, the reminders carved into public memory. And in the wind-swept desert outside Mesa, one echo still lingered. The voice of a young woman who had simply wanted a fresh start. The desert has its own kind of memory. It keeps the outlines of what once was a footprint here, a tire marked there, and then lets the wind decide what stays. By the summer of 2025, the story of Emily Pike had become more than a case file. It was a scar carved into Arizona's collective conscience. 5 months had passed since her disappearance, and yet no one could truly move on. Mesa had changed. The once quiet suburb now carried a strange awareness that safety was fragile, that the line between ordinary and unthinkable could vanish in a single night. Detective Ramirez still carried Emily's photo in her coat pocket. The edges had begun to curl. The ink had faded slightly, but reminded her of why she kept pushing long after the headlines began to fade. By June, the search for Darren Holt had turned into a waiting game. There were sightings, rumors, fragments of leads, but no solid trace. Every few days, tips came in. A mechanic seen hitchhiking near Safford, a man camping near Roosevelt Lake. But when deputies arrived, there was always nothing. Then, one morning, an old rancher named Bill Gardner called in from the edges of the Superstition Mountains. He'd noticed a small shack in a dry ravine, one that hadn't been there a year ago. At first, he thought it was an abandoned hunting cabin. But the moment he stepped inside, he saw the walls. Photos, maps, newspaper clippings. And in the center, taped above a dusty mattress, was Emily Pike's missing poster. The cabin was surrounded within hours. The heat that day was unbearable, the kind that makes the air shimmer, turning the horizon into liquid. Deputies moved in with caution, unsure Holt was still inside. He wasn't, but what they found inside was more telling than a confession could ever be. A pile of Emily's belongings, a charm bracelet, the same one her mother had mentioned in her first interview, a small sketchbook filled with pencil drawings of desert flowers and telephone poles, and a folded note, scrawled in uneven handwriting. It read, she wanted to go home. I didn't mean for it to go this way. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting matched records from Holt's employment forms at the group home. It wasn't enough for closure, not legally, not morally, but it was something, a fragment of truth buried in dust. Forensic teams swept the cabin, finding DNA traces consistent with Holt. They confirmed he'd been there recently, maybe within the last few weeks. But again, he'd slipped through the cracks. The wilderness around the superstitions is vast, a labyrinth of canyons and caves that can hide a man for years. Still, the discovery shifted the narrative. To many, it was confirmation of what they already believed, that Holt had lured Emily away, perhaps under the guise of helping her leave the group home, and that something had gone wrong. The exact details remained murky, but the outline was there, enough to give shape to the unimaginable. By July, as the investigation formally expanded into a federal manhunt, Emily's law was signed by the governor of Arizona. The bill passed unanimously. It was a rare moment of unity. Under the new law, group homes were required to install real-time monitoring systems for residents under supervision, enforce mandatory check-ins every 2 hours, and immediately alert law enforcement when a resident was unaccounted for. The measure also funded trauma recovery programs and investigative liaisons to prevent delays in missing person reports. For Rachel Pike, it was bittersweet. If this law saves one girl, she said quietly, standing at the ceremony with her husband's hand in hers, then maybe Emily's name won't just be a memory. Maybe it'll mean something. That night, Mesa held one final vigil, not in mourning, but in remembrance. Hundreds gathered beneath the desert sky. They held candles and photos, their flickering light stretching across the parking lot like a constellation. Someone played a recording of Emily singing, a shaky home video from years before. Her voice, soft and unsure, floated through the air. For a brief moment, it felt like she was still there. Detective Ramirez stood at the edge of the crowd, her badge tucked away, her face half lit by candlelight. She thought about all the hours spent chasing shadows, about how justice in real life rarely feels complete. The man responsible was still out there, maybe living under another name, maybe already gone, but Emily's story had already done something powerful. It had forced people to look closer, at the flaws in the system, at the overlooked kids who slipped through bureaucratic cracks, at the silence that too often follows the forgotten, and perhaps that, Ramirez thought, was its own kind of justice. A month later, as monsoon season rolled into the desert, a hiker reported finding human remains deep in the ravines near the Superstition foothills. When investigators arrived, they found a decomposed body, partially covered by rockfall. The medical examiner would later confirm through dental records that it was Darren Holt. No gun, no weapon, just a single backpack and a faded note tucked into his wallet. It read only, "Tell her mother I'm sorry." The news brought a strange silence over Mesa. For Rachel Pike, there were no tears, just an exhale that sounded like release. "Now," she said in a statement, "maybe Emily can finally rest." The case officially closed 2 weeks later. But closure, as everyone learned, is rarely clean. Emily's photo still hangs in the precinct hallway, framed beside other victims who never had the chance to grow old. The group home where she once lived has since been restructured, with new leadership and protocols. Her former roommates, now scattered across the state, still talk about her when they can bear it. Every January 27th, people gather by the roadside near Highway 60, the place where Emily's story ended. They bring flowers, candles, and handwritten letters. Some stand in silence. Others whisper prayers. And when the wind moves to the canyon, it carries a sound of rustling leaves, soft, almost musical. Locals say that on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear footsteps in the gravel. A girl walking home beneath a sky full of stars, finally free from the noise, from the fear, from the silence. Her name, written in candlelight and ink, has become part of Arizona's story, not just as a victim, but as a reminder that behind every missing poster, there's a heartbeat that deserved more time. And though the desert may bury what it cannot return, it never truly forgets.